Just pull up my cheat sheet here. Okay. Well, good morning. This is the December 2nd meeting of the Lower Downtown Design Review Commission, and we're going to call the meeting to order. Before we begin the discussion, we'll quickly go over the public comment options. Or do we need to, Jen?
We don't. There's no public comment for today, so yeah.
Awesome. Okay. Then why don't we then move to the introduction of commissioners? So I'll ask each commissioner to provide their name and their position, and I'll call on each person in order to accomplish that. So let's start with Tom.
Tom Sulla, general contractor.
And Mike.
Mike Coughlin, developer.
Fred.
Fred Blick, property owner.
Jim.
Jim Grabner, resident.
And Heather.
Heather Vasquez Johnson, practicing architect.
And I'm Jane Chrysler, chair and preservation architect. That is, oh, and just in time. We have John. Welcome, John.
Hi.
Hi. So we're just introducing ourselves by name and your position on the board. So you were perfect timing for that.
John McIntyre, principal with Tribal Architects here in town and member at large.
Awesome. Thank you for that. All right. So then I think our business item to start with is to approve the minutes from our last meeting. So do any commissioners have comments or clarifications for the September 2nd, 2021 meeting record? Because I had to wait for it to be certified. If not, would anyone like to make a motion?
Move approval.
Thank you, Jim. Is there a second?
I'll second.
Thank you, Heather. So the meeting record for September 2nd is approved. And so at this
Hey
point,
Jane, isn't it the October meeting record?
oh, was it the October?
October 9th, I think.
Yeah, I think it was October
October
7th.
7th. Yeah.
I'm sorry, I had it written down wrong.
And do we need to do a vote?
Yeah.
So do we need to amend the motion? Sorry.
Yes, I think you need to amend the motion and you need to have a vote on that.
Agreed.
Someone needs to make
I second the amendment.
Who is Mike is making the amendment because you were the one who mentioned it. We'll put it that way.
Yeah.
So we're approving the October.
Well, the irony is I'm going to abstain then because I was absent at that meeting.
That's okay.
Well, yeah, you can still move to amend, but then my agreement to the amendment has to be noted too.
Robert's rules.
Yep.
So then did we get, Jim, it sounded like you approved the amendment. Heather, you seconded the approval?
I did.
Okay. So then we'll do a roll call vote. And start with Tom.
Tom Sulla, aye.
Mike.
Abstain.
Fred.
Abstain.
Jim.
Aye.
John.
Aye.
Heather.
Aye.
And Jane Chrysler, aye. So now the motion passes. Thank you, everyone. And so now I believe, Jen, we can move on to, we have no consent agenda and no design and review agenda. So it would just be moving on to business items.
Yeah, so it's just the calendar for 2022.
Okay.
And we, just for everyone's benefit, and Jane, do you mind muting for a second?
Muting, yeah.
Yeah. All right. So for everyone's benefit, we took a look, Emily and I and other Landmark staff took a look at all of the dates for the year. And I don't think there were any adjustments, Emily, does that sound right? To the calendar? Oh, now we can't hear you. I know, weird. It's one of those days. No.
Jen, the only thing is if it's going to be September 1, September 8, or September 8, September 15, I think.
Yes, thank you. I thought there might have been one. Okay, so because of the holiday for Labor Day, we weren't sure if you guys wanted to do September, it would be September 1st and 8th normally, but that would be the Thursday before Labor Day, which sometimes people take off. So we weren't sure if you guys would have a quorum that day. So if you want to shift it to the 8th and the 15th, that would be fine.
Yeah. So moved.
So, okay, so we'll just need someone to make a motion saying that you approve the meeting record with whichever days modified. Not the meeting record, sorry, the 2022 calendar.
Right, I move the proposed calendar with the clarification that we would do the September meeting on September 8th, September 15th.
I'll second.
Okay, so thank you, Mike, for the motion and Heather for the second. And so Jen, we should do another vote. All right, so let's start with Tom.
Aye.
Mike,
Aye.
Fred,
Aye.
Jim,
Aye.
John,
Aye.
Heather,
Aye.
and Jane is an aye, so motion passes unanimously.
Great, thanks. So we had one withdrawn discussion item today, and it sounded like Jim wanted to make a comment on the record about that. So since Jane didn't hear that part before the meeting started.
I just wanted to say that I noted the commentator there, the presenter was going to be Doty, and having raised the issue before that Doty is responsible for some 25% of the land in the lower downtown area. I think it's wonderful that they are finally at least making some steps, taking some steps to bring some of their work and plans before the commission for information purposes at least. And we hope that, or I hope that they will certainly join in being a vital part of the commission's work as we move forward. Thank you.
All right, Jane, do you, I'm happy to introduce Dante now. Do you want to do so, or I'm not the chair, I know, but I know how noisy your background is, so I didn't want to.
Yes, Jen, I have a feeling that would be the better option if you don't mind.
Okay, sounds good. All right.
And I'll step away then. Thank you all. And Dante, I'll see you next week instead. Thank you all. Bye.
See you, Fred.
Well, it's my pleasure to welcome Dante James. He's going to be talking with us about having a discussion on equity, which is wonderful. He gave a training to all of planning services staff a few years ago, and it was really phenomenal. And so I'm excited to participate again, and excited for you all to participate. So Dante, welcome. I'm going to make you a co-host, and then you can share whatever you would like on your screen and all of that stuff. Oh, we can't hear you. Oh no. What is this connection today? Oh, yeah.
Yes.
Yes.
Okay.
You're a little quiet, but yes.
Okay, I'll try to speak up then.
Better.
Good morning, everyone. Thank you for the opportunity to come and share in this conversation with you. It's much appreciated. And as Jennifer said, I've done some work off and on with planning and different work there, which has been enjoyable and hopefully fruitful. I think the answer to that question is yes, it has been fruitful. The organization I work with is called the Gemini Group. I'm one of the founders. And this is the work that we do around the country with organizations, state and local government, higher ed, K through 12, just a variety of organizations really working to provide some sense of understanding and an ability to understand how to infuse the concept of equity into organizational work. And appreciate the chance to have this conversation with each and every one of you. Just me, I've been in and out of politics for a long time. I've worked for 4 different mayors in 3 different cities. I'm a recovering attorney. I'm a veteran. I was a canine cop in the military. I run nonprofits, just kind of a wide variety of background. I tell folks, if we look at my resume, it looks like I can't keep a job. So this is just the kind of culmination of all of those things in this consulting work that we do. And so before I get started, I would love to hear from each of you just who you are and how long you've been on the commission, and maybe that's it, maybe what your quote unquote real job is, if you still have one. And so we'd just love to hear from you. So I'm not gonna try to figure out where to start. I'll just let you just kind of popcorn.
Well, I'm generally the first to vote, so I would. I'm Tom Sella. I've been in Denver native. I was a general contractor for over 40 years. That's all I know. I just retired from that. Been with the commission for a year and a half, I think. That's about right. So that's my brief history.
Thank you.
Yeah, we're in order of voting, so how about Mike?
Okay. Welcome, Dante. Nice to meet you. I'm Mike Coughlin. I think I've been on the commission 4.5 years, 5 years, something like that. I work for a family business, Coughlin and Company, started by my grandfather in the 1930s, and we mostly do real estate development. We've done some historic properties in lower downtown Denver and Lowry, but we've also done just sort of some miscellaneous apartment communities and office buildings. I've been on the board of Historic Denver as well, and Colorado Preservation, Inc. Welcome.
Thank you.
So yeah, how about Jim?
Okay. Hi, Dante. Welcome. Good to have you here. Jim Grabner. I've been on the board for years now. And also have had my own consulting business for 20 years in the field of urban transportation. I've lived in Lodo for 27 years. So that's back to the second wave of settlers in that part of the city. That's pretty much it.
Thank you.
I'm next. I'm John McIntyre. I'm a architect and urban designer, originally from New Zealand. I moved to Denver around 8 years ago now. I'm the freshest member of the board, I think, still. So I've only been on a few months. My, previous to living in Denver, worked a few different places around the world: London, New York, Toronto, and back home in Australasia. So have had a focus on adaptive reuse and preservation work throughout my career.
And I think that I'm it. Heather Vasquez Johnson. I have been on this board for about 1.5 years, but prior to that, I served a term for 3 years on the Landmark Preservation Commission. And I am a practicing architect. We office right now currently in Lodo, so I'm very familiar. Yeah, that's about it.
And then I'm Jane Chrysler. I'm the current chair, and I came on board with Mike. It was 4.5, 5 years ago. I'm an architect, but my background is I have a degree in historic preservation as well. So I've been originally from Virginia, but I've been practicing architecture in Colorado since for a little over 20 years. And yeah, I'm thrilled to participate in this session, and I'm thrilled that the city is providing this to us. So thank you.
Did you get everybody?
I think that's it. It's just me. Yep.
All right. Well, again, appreciate the chance to have this conversation. This session is typically 4 hours, so forgive me if I sound like I'm talking fast, because there's a lot squeezed into a short period of time. And the conversation is, as you know, is around equity, and most specifically racial equity. And when I talk about race, I'm really talking about race and ethnicities of color. And the idea of the approach that we do is founded in something called targeted universalism that's been posited by Professor John Powell out of UC Berkeley. Essentially, that by focusing on those who are most impacted in society, you will then positively impact everyone else. But if you try to be all things to all people at all times, you end up maybe being not much to anybody. So our focus is on race and ethnicities and color, because by any social indicator of success, your race will absolutely predict, in general terms, certainly, those outcomes. And race will drop you to the bottom of the bottom by most any social indicator of success. And so the focus that we take this is starting with race and ethnicities and color. And it's really a conversation around the dominant culture and how the dominant culture in this country impacts those not within it. And so in this country, the dominant culture is straight, white, Christian, able-bodied, and male. And so how do we evaluate how maybe that dominant culture paradigm impacts and affects everyone and everything not within it? There's a PowerPoint that I'll share off and on. I'll unshare it as much as possible, just so we can have some conversation and see who we're talking to. And I recognize that, what you do is different than, preservation or historic designations and it's more architectural. But I would suggest too that, culture still plays a part in those buildings that you are evaluating for what gets done to the facade or any other kind of way to the buildings in lower downtown. So appreciate the distinction that you bring in this conversation. So I'm going to share the screen and we'll just get started. And hopefully, it's not going to be me sitting up here preaching to you for 2 hours. We'll hopefully have some good, robust conversation. And the goal is not to change your mind about anything. It's really hopefully to provide maybe different perspectives on how you can consider or think about the work that you do, or just how you walk around the world. And so it's really not a effort to change anyone's mind. And I'll also say this is not a diversity conversation. Most of you have probably had to go through some type of diversity training, which tends to be beat up on White Guy Day. And that's not what this is, because it takes everybody to do this work and really understand how this work can be implemented in no matter what we do. So I'm going to share the screen, and hopefully there will be no IT issues, and we'll just get going. So, slideshow. And here we go. So first and foremost, it's the most difficult conversation to have around race. We can talk about gender, we can talk about sexual orientation, we can talk about religion. Talking about race just tends to be the most difficult conversation that anybody has. And so in this conversation, there's no blame in it, certainly not for me. There's no blame, there's no shame, there's no effort to make anybody feel guilty about anything, because that doesn't benefit anyone. So really, how do we accept responsibility to ensure that we're doing things in the best way possible and take that responsibility? And as you're not government employees, but you represent government on the commission and doing what you do. And so how are we ensuring that we are best serving everyone in the way that they best need to be served? So I often describe this conversation as customer service on steroids, because it really is, how are we serving everyone in the best way possible? What we're going to just have some conversations about is the root causes of the racial inequities that exist and government's complicity in their creation and maintenance. Learn to identify those inequities and what strategies can we utilize to reduce or eliminate them across all identities, because the intersectionality of identities is real, and we all bring many multiple identities to this conversation, be male, female, Muslim, Christian, tall, short, whatever that might be. We all bring multiple identities. And then what are some approaches to reduce institutional implicit bias, because institutions have bias. And so we'll talk just very briefly about personal bias, but more specifically institutional bias and how that impacts what we do. Sorry. So before I start this, what's up next is just a brief video. I'm just kind of explaining the idea of institutional and systemic bias and racism separate from individual, because this conversation, at least this morning, is almost exclusively about institutional and systemic issues. So we'll just watch this and have a conversation.
Moving the race conversation forward. You've probably noticed that when our news media talks about race, when they talk about racism, when they talk about racial justice issues, they quite often talk about it all wrong. But have you ever tried to quantify exactly how and why the media gets it wrong about race and what we can do to fix it? Well, there's a new paper published by Race Forward entitled Moving the Race Conversation Forward that sets out to do just that by compiling nearly 1,200 articles from major newspapers and cable news outlets and systematically breaking down the most common mistakes we fall into when we talk about race. And in their research, Race Forward identified 7 harmful practices, the 7 most common bad habits in media coverage of race, as well as recommended strategies to get us back on track. And I recommend reading all 7 for yourself, but right now I want to focus on just one of the biggest traps that racial justice conversations fall into, which is our tendency to focus too much on individuals instead of systems. Because when we talk about race, when we talk about racism, when we talk about racial justice, it's important to remember that there are levels to this thing. There are at least 4 different levels of racism that each need to be considered. The first level is internalized racism, which is all the prejudice, bias, and blind spots you might have within yourself as an individual. The next level after that is interpersonal racism, which is what happens when we act out that internalized racism on each other. Those 2 levels, the internalized and the interpersonal, are the 2 individual levels of racism. And those are the simplest ones to focus on, the easiest to recognize in our day-to-day lives, the ones we spend most of our time talking about, but I'm here to tell you, there's something else. Systemic racism. Once you get past those individual levels, first of all, you have to deal with institutional racism. The racist policies and discriminatory practices in schools and workplaces and government agencies that routinely produce unjust outcomes for people of color. And when you step beyond that level, you have structural racism, the unjust, racist patterns and practices that play out across the institutions that make up our society. The individual and systemic levels of racism are both important, both necessary to reckon with, and they're both usually interrelated. But if you want a real, fully clear-sighted conversation on racial justice, you have to be talking about both levels. And one of the most common ways we fail to see the big picture on race is by failing to think about systemic racism, by failing to be systemically aware. In their research, Race Forward found that our media coverage far too often falls into that trap. They found that approximately 2/3 of race-focused media coverage fails to consider how systemic racism factors into the story. 2/3 of their coverage of race fails to be systemically aware. And that is a problem. When we constantly focus only on individual stories, it distorts our sense of how racism works. It encourages us to see racism only as the product of overt, intentional racist acts by individuals that can be fixed simply by shaming and correcting those individual defects. And it encourages us to see individual stories of transcending racism as proof that there is no more racism. That if we have a black president and Oprah is a billionaire, then there must not be anything else to talk about. And any problems that other people of color still face must be due to deficiencies on their part. It must be a problem with them instead of a problem with the system. And that is no, just no. We cannot have a real, thorough conversation about incarceration rates for people of color, about the thousands of families torn apart by our immigration policies, about the perennial disparities in education, housing, healthcare, employment opportunities. We cannot have real talk about any of the biggest issues that affect us all as individuals if we are not also thinking about the systems involved. We cannot have a discourse that brings us closer to racial justice without being systemically aware. So next time you listen to the news or read the news or watch the news or surf the news, you should take a minute to ask yourself, is this coverage systemically aware?
So would love to just get your thoughts maybe on his question of media and maybe where you have seen examples in the last few years where the issue is clouded in race, but the focus has been on the individuals involved as opposed to taking a look at the institution or the system more specifically. So any thoughts or examples that you can come up with in the last few years? Been plenty just in the last few months. Sports, legal system.
It's terrible to say that I don't remember much news other than COVID right now, sadly.
The
So
TV coverage of Rittenhouse versus Ahmad, I thought had some elements of that in it. Quite a few, actually.
Yeah, and certainly, you know, when you look at the process of jury selection in Ahmad's case, of all of the potential jurors, all but one who were Black were excused by the prosecution. And the judge even said he believed that that was based in racial discrimination, but there wasn't anything he could do about it. And as a, again, recovering defense attorney, I would disagree with that. But again, an example of the systemic issue that maybe could have a conversation. I appreciate that.
I probably got a couple of good examples from around our Thanksgiving dinner table with some of the family, to be honest, in terms of having chats about general media and issues with in-laws and relatives and others. And it, you know, quickly, I think just based on the way media coverage is working, it becomes quite individualized discussions about, specific people, specific actions versus kind of broader institutional framework, which I think is probably pretty consistent with how these things tend to be discussed both in media and in discussions around media coverage sometimes.
Honestly, it's much easier to focus on the individual and that one player in whatever the process is, then step back and look at the bigger picture of how might the institution or the system be influencing how that outcome really happens.
It seems that we want to, we want to talk about people. We like talk everybody, it's kind of a natural thing to it also makes conversations more personal or some other things. So I think there's just some general things about how we like to talk about issues that drive us in that direction too, probably.
Other thoughts?
Since you mentioned sports, Colin Kaepernick is always one that sticks out to me as being very, very focused on an individual as opposed to system.
Yep. And he was very clear why he was taking a knee, right? It wasn't because he didn't like the flag, didn't like the country, was disrespecting the troops, none of that. He was very clear on what his issue was, but the focus tended to be more on him than anything else. And the NFL has even recognized its own deficiencies in that regard, but has never apologized to Colin Kaepernick.
And he's never been hired.
Nope. And so I would suggest that the conversation around institutions and systems has become much more prevalent after this country watched the murder of a Black man over and over last summer on TV. And then there's been more conversations around the institution of policing and the system of criminal justice. But I would suggest that prior to that, there were only pockets of those conversations, if you heard them at all. They were always about the individual actors that were in play versus looking at the institution of policing, for example, in the training and who's hired and what is the culture and climate within police departments. Now healthcare is talking about it. Education is talking about it. You are talking about it. So the idea of looking at the system has become more prevalent. And the question is, how long will it last? Right? How will we just go back to looking at it the way we used to look at it, as opposed to doing a deeper dive and interrogating the systems that are in play? Any final thoughts before I keep going? and speaking of sports, I'll give one more example. You mentioned Colin Kaepernick, but it was, I'm not a big sports fan, but maybe 2 months ago now, that the head coach of, was it Oakland? One of the head coaches was fired because of homophobic and racist and misogynistic emails that he had been sending for the last decade. And he was fired because it was uncovered by a newspaper. But clearly he was having these conversations internally with players and leadership within the NFL. But the NFL, the system or the institution of the NFL didn't do anything until they had no choice because the coach was outed. And so the institution itself was maintaining its own silence, which was then making it complicit in how he was continuing to communicate in the way he did that. So again, we could focus on the individual coach, but look back and bigger to the NFL more broadly. Jane?
Just gonna say, and I'm not a football expert, even though I seem to be talking a lot of football, but yeah, there was an opinion piece that just came out about that said that he was targeted by an assassin. So again, it was very towards the individual and not at all about the NFL itself and maybe the culture, and just focusing on how this was a vendetta against others.
Again, just an example of looking at how we look at systems and institutions. I appreciate that. So I'm going to share the screen and keep going. So first and foremost, at least as this gets presented this morning, it's not a partisan issue. It's not a political issue. Really trying to understand and recognize how we best serve everyone shouldn't be a partisan issue. It's been hijacked to be one by not just both sides of the aisle, because there's more than two parties, but by lots of different entities. But certainly politically, it's been hijacked to become a partisan issue. But for us, as we do this work, it's not, because how are we ensuring that we're serving everyone in the best way possible? And certainly as government representatives, that's our role, is to best serve everyone. And so for us, this is not a partisan issue at all, and you won't hear any politics coming out of this conversation. So what's up next is the answer, at least our answer to the question, why do we need to focus on race? Because, you know, we focused on poverty, we can address everything. And let's focus on gender, because we know women still don't make what men make. Or let's focus on LGBTQ, because you can still be hired and not, or fired and not hired in many places for being gay, all of which deserve focused strategic attention to eradicate. But it's the position that we do, which is that there's, again, been nothing as impactful in this country, nor continues to be, as is race. And race is, in certainly general terms, an absolute predictor to what outcomes will be. So what's up next is just a brief slideshow of some of the legal and legislative decisions in this country that have been based purely on race. Again, as our answer to the question, why do we need to focus on race the way that everybody is saying we need to now? So there's no sound to this, so we'll just watch this and then have a conversation after. So we put this in here to demonstrate that this was not just some Southern issue. Oregon was the only state that made it to the Union with an exclusion clause in its constitution that said Black people can't live nor move into the state. There were already Black folks living there, so it couldn't kick them out. So it then passed what it called the lash law, which just said you can live here, we'll just whip you twice a year until you decide to leave. It wasn't removed from Oregon's constitution, nor technically legal for Black folks to move into the state until 1926. And if you don't know what a mulatto is someone who's half Black, half white. And I'm guessing you know this is not a true statement. The 13th Amendment did not abolish slavery. If you read the amendment, the second half of the phrasing provides for an exception, which says you can still be made a slave as punishment for a crime, or if you're under the jurisdiction of the criminal justice system. I know you can't read the article that's attached to this. What this case was a woman who was trying to get herself legally declared an octoroon, which would have meant she would be considered 1/8 Black, so that she could marry the Black man who she loved, because it was illegal for white folks and Black folks to become married. Interestingly enough, in this case, the judge was two-time Denver mayor and KKK member Ben Stapleton, who ruled against her. After the ruling, they still went out and got married, and they both got arrested. So this is not some new conversation talking about race. We've been talking about race in this country since before it was a country. Laws, legislation based in race, racism was built into the fabric of this country, brick by brick, law by law, legislation by legislation. And if we're going to undo it, we need to undo it in the same targeted, focused, strategic, and unapologetic way, or else we're just going to keep playing hopscotch, one issue at a time. And so if we had 4 hours, we'd put you in a small group to have some conversations, but we're not, so we're going to do it here. So just would love to hear from you. What was new, surprising, or impactful to you about what you just saw? What was new, surprising, or impactful to you? And or if you have some questions, I can probably put some context around most of those slides. But we'd just love to hear from you about what maybe was surprising or impactful to you in those slides.
Well, and impactful, just the one after another, after another, after another, after another slide of information of our history. It's a lot to take in. It's, it's overwhelming. It's consistent.
And that's probably the majority of the responses that we get from the thousands of folks we've done this with, is how impactful it is, because it just keeps on coming. And or they just had no idea of the depth and breadth of how racism was built into this country.
I would say what struck me was the comparison of what was included in that slide montage versus what I learned in school. Some being part of and some not. So, and especially as folks who study historic preservation or have interest in historic preservation, it's that whole thought about what it is that is considered history and what we are preserving and what is included and what is not included.
Right. No, very true. And we do work with school districts, and so you have all read all the drama going on at school board meetings and everything else about critical race theory, et cetera. And I don't want to get all into that, but a good chunk of this is never taught. It's just history. I mean, we can describe whether it's bad or good, but it just is history. That there's a professor at Princeton, Dr. Michael Eric Dyson, who describes this as living in the United States of amnesia, because we just don't know, or we just don't address it, and we keep on repeating the same things that we've done in the past. Any other thoughts, or maybe patterns that you saw in that?
I know I'm not on the commission, but I'm taking this training too. So I think that what's really striking to me is that it's all the pattern is across the board racism. It's not targeted to one group. It's really anyone that looks different or acts different. And that's terrible.
Again, that dominant culture. And I would argue that it's based on fear, fear of the loss of power by that white dominant culture. It's the fear of that loss of power from the very beginning in the 1600s. And so it's just a continuation. And then to your point, Jennifer, it's kind of like, whose turn is it? You know, there is no scientific basis for race, period. It's a legal and social construction. There is no science behind the concept of race. Even though there's been, certainly you saw the Supreme Court making great efforts to describe and define legally what that is. Takawazawa, who was Japanese, was born in Japan and came to this country and became an attorney, took his own case to the Supreme Court. The Supreme Court said, you're not Caucasian, therefore you can't become a naturalized citizen. The next year, Singh Tin, who is Indian, and by quote unquote racial classifications, Indians are Caucasian. He was actually born in the Caucasoid Mountains. And so the Supreme Court had screwed itself the year before. And so to read the decision, it twists itself in knots to describe how you may be Caucasian, but because of your language, your religion, your hairstyle, your way of dress, no one walking down the street would ever consider you culturally white. Therefore, you still can't become a citizen. And that did not change. You could not become a naturalized citizen in this country if you were a person of color until the mid-50s. Anyone surprised by Colorado's history?
Just so I don't think any of you all know this, but Denver Landmark Preservation has been doing a historic context on studying the Latino and Chicano communities, working with those communities very closely to tell the history of the Latinos and Chicanos in Denver through 1990. And I just read a draft of the report a couple weeks ago, and it is amazing. It's so interesting. And so what you showed on the slides of Colorado is consistent with what I read. There's more to it there as well. But anyway.
Yeah, it was estimated that in the 20s and early 30s, that of all white men over the age of 21, 50% or more were members of the KKK. And the focus of the KKK in Colorado, not to minimize it at all, wasn't lynching and cross burning, although those things happened, but it was more about infusing itself into the systems within Colorado, becoming judges, becoming chiefs of police, becoming mayors, becoming, you know, within those systems to have that level of influence. And so that was just Colorado. That was Colorado. And I would imagine if you own a home built before 1970 or certainly 1965, in your deed is a restrictive covenant that says you can't sell your home to a Negro, to an Oriental, or to a Jew. So it's baked into Colorado as well. I mean, there's sundown towns all around the state, assuming you know what those are. So all of that history in Colorado is still there. So why is that important to know in the first place? So I would suggest it's important because, one, you represent government, and there is a built-in trust deficit with many communities that you will engage with or maybe be responsive to that you had nothing to do with, But there's a trust deficit. So the idea of just saying, trust me because I'm on the commission, I'm from government, doesn't work because of all that you've seen, because folks know their history. Latinos know their history, Black folks know their history, Indigenous know their history. And it's not just history, right? It's so still real and personal and relevant to so many communities. I mean, I know Japanese folks who have family members who were in the concentration camps, right? And one of which was in Colorado, right? I've spoken to Native folks who were in Indian boarding schools, if you know what those are. And in Canada, they're called residential schools, and they found thousands of dead children buried on the grounds of those schools because of the horrific treatment that they received. And the same investigation is now going on in the United States. And the last school run by the federal government that way closed in Utah in 1985. And so when folks talk about it, they still cry and have a hard time trusting public education. My father died before he could legally take his white wife to Arkansas to visit his family. So this is not just a history lesson. It's still so real and relevant right now today in maybe the communities and the folks that you will engage with. And so recognizing that there may be that built-in trust deficit and understanding where it comes from may be at least helpful in terms of the interactions that you are required to have. Okay. Final thoughts, questions? And I'll say this is not just a US issue. We've done this work internationally. By any stretch of the imagination, the darker your skin, no matter where you are, the harsher your outcomes, just like this. Even in countries of color, the harsher your outcomes, the darker your skin. All right, I'm going to share the screen and keep on going. So just did that. So to the title of this session, what is equity? What is equity? There's all kinds of definitions and descriptions, and I know the city of Denver has its own. This is our definition, simply that equity is achieved when one's identity cannot predict the outcome. And so equity is concerned with outcomes, not intentions. And also our focus is not on access or opportunity, because you can give me access or an opportunity to avail myself of your program, of your grant, of trying to get a designation. But if the internal process of evaluation is still biased, my outcomes may never change. And so for us, it's the outcomes that tell the story. And there's nothing wrong with equality, but you don't treat your friends, your family, or your clients equally, because they all need something different from you to best succeed. And so the idea is, how do we take those boxes which represent resources and allocate or reallocate them, be they time, be they budget. You don't have an unlimited budget, you don't have unlimited time. So how do you allocate them in the best way so that everyone has the chance to achieve that success of whatever it is that you're doing in the designation or the determinations that you come up with? If the fences represents a barrier to achieving that success, I mean, if it's a law, you can't change that. You can't change that. But how do you then provide the best opportunity to address that? Or if it's a policy, you can remove that fence because you can change that policy tomorrow. So can we shrink that fence? Can we make it see-through? Can we remove it? Right? Are there really, is the general question, the way to look at this, at the picture, and it's about how do we allocate in the best way our resources? Just a different way to look at the idea of equity, just based on size or ability. You can give everybody a bicycle. You know, they're all downtown with the scooters and the ride share and the car share and the bikes you can rent, but not everybody can do that. Not everybody can utilize them. So, you know, we can give everybody shoes, or we can give everyone a pair of shoes that fit. So how do we look at the idea of equity? So, and it's not, as I said, it's not a diversity conversation, because you can have diversity all day and never change an outcome if the system has not evaluated itself to ensure that bias is removed from how it functions. So equity is looking at policies, programs, practices, procedures, just everyday way that we do what we do to evaluate those outcomes. And if our outcomes seem to be skewed a particular way, we have to then work backwards to determine what it is that might be maintaining that status quo. And it might have nothing to do with racial bias or any other kind of bias. That's the outcome. But if we don't take a look, we'll never know the answer to the question and know where we are and how well we are doing for all of our communities. So next up, we'll give you a little short counting test. So we're going to watch this, then we'll have a conversation.
This is an awareness test. How many passes does the team in white make?
Go!
The answer is 13.
I get it?
But did you see the moonwalking bear?
Go!
So it's easy to miss what you're not looking for, which really leads us into the conversation around bias. Bias, everyone has it. No one is immune. That's even the right word. We all have bias, right? And in this context, it's just the tendency to favor or disfavor how we evaluate one group or its members in relation to another. But the hard part in this conversation is that the implicit biases that we hold don't necessarily align with who or what we say we are, or even reflect things that we would explicitly endorse. And that's that harder part. Our actions may be counter to who and what we say we really are sometimes. And so there's two brains working all the time. The unconscious brain is collecting 11 million bits of information per second. It's operating that fast, just lightning speed, right? All those things that are happening around us that we hear that we're not paying attention to, that we see out the corner of our eyes that we're not paying attention to, is still being collected and evaluated. But the conscious brain is only processing 40 bits of information so that we can focus on those things that require our constant, focused, deliberate concentration. And so there's lots of different kinds of bias. We're just going to talk about two very briefly. One is affinity bias, right? The birds of a feather flock together kind of concept. We just have an affinity with someone, or it just felt good because maybe they attended the same college we did, they grew up in the same town, or they remind us of our cousin, or they like doing the same things. That's fine, that's great. It's normal. But then how does that impact our decision making if we're not conscious of that affinity? And you often see this in recruitment or just hiring in that process, because well, they might get the benefit of the doubt because even though they didn't say something, well, I know they went to this school, so they probably know that anyway because I went to that school, as an example. It just is a natural way of how we address folks and evaluate and engage with people. Confirmation bias is the tendency to seek out information that already confirms what we believe. It's just not normal to seek out information that's contradictory to what we believe. If we do that, it's a very conscious effort to do it, right? And you see this certainly in evaluation processes. If you have that employee who is just always the problem child or is always needing assistance, we're going to find more errors as we evaluate that. Or if we got a rock star client, or we have a rock star community, or we know that this architect always brings us the most beautiful presentation for us to determine whether we're going to allow this facade to go on this building. We're not going to find errors in the same way because we already believe that they are just a rock star. So how does that confirmation bias really impact how we evaluate and what we do? And again, implicit bias, that unconscious, it just happens in microseconds, because before we knew how to make fire, we had to determine in milliseconds who or what was friend or foe. And we still do that in some kind of way, but it's not necessary in the same way. And if we're not aware of those biases that we do have, then they still play out and impact how we do what we do. And so to you, where do you see the possibility of either of these two maybe impacting or playing out in the work that you do in your evaluation of how you hear from communities, all of those things? Where do you see either confirmation bias or affinity bias possibly impacting or playing out in the work that the commission does?
Well, we try not to do it. We try to rely on written guidelines, obviously. I would say that when presentations are slick and professional, maybe the content gets a bit more, I don't know, sign off, rather than just the pure content. I'm not really thinking of any examples where I believe we've acted that way, but I think that is a possibility. I think that we sometimes see familiar applicants who we have seen them before this happens with signage, especially because they're limited vendors. And so maybe after a number of years, you know, it's like, oh, you guys do great signs. And you kind of feel that way before they even present because we've seen them previously. That might be confirmation bias. But our process is guideline based, and our commission and our staff tries really, really hard to continually remember that. I think to battle the possibility of subjectivity, we really try to avoid subjectivity as much as we possibly can, but doesn't mean you can eliminate it. You know,
appreciate that. And I think it's a great example of, you know, we tend to give the benefit of the doubt to information received in the same way we like to give it. So when you're evaluating that slick proposal or presentation, wow, this is just like I would do it. So it might get the benefit of the doubt without even us really being conscious of that. So great example. Heather?
I was to say, I agree with Mike, and I just thinking back on my time on the Landmark Preservation Commission versus the LDDRC, I think that probably happened a little bit more frequently, just because on the LPC, you get a lot more applicants that are, you know, homeowners who just want to replace their fence, versus developers, architects, people like that who are doing big, you know, infill projects or things like that. And so there's a very distinct level of quality from a package that you get that an architect has put together, that a developer's put together, that's very thorough, very complete, very slick, as Mike put it, versus you know, something that comes in from a homeowner that's just a hand-drawn sketch of where they want to put a fence or a retaining wall. So you know, it's that same kind of thing. And I feel like it's a little bit it was easier to take on that bias on LPC than on LDDRC, just kind of by the nature of what you got in terms of submittals.
I appreciate that.
It's interesting too, just in the context of the work that we do, and I know that we try and think about this in the work that we're doing as well, is just kind of buildings as a reflection of culture and a reflection of values and what those buildings stand for. And we have a complete affinity bias in terms of our guidelines and work for what we're preserving, which is a city of a downtown that was developed at a certain time that reflects the values of a time. And it's interesting to try and, it's a very abstract thing to try and figure out, but it's also just, I guess, as we start to think around guidelines and how they work and new guidelines and other things, and ensuring that there's space in those guidelines to value, I know from my background, the architectural history is a sort of a distillation of cultural history, right? And maybe even a more like, it's such a Western, tradition with a lineage that when we study architectural and art history goes back directly through certain specific cultures, and those cultures get picked, and that moves from era to era. And that's how we often look at buildings and the history of buildings in those kind of really distinctive, focused periods that are reflections of very specific cultures, like the Italian Renaissance, and these kind of values that found their way into buildings. So it's not that there's any answers there, but it's just an interesting thing to be aware of as we continue to look at our guidelines and refine what it is that we're trying to preserve in our neighborhoods and our buildings and other things, to kind of have broad lenses.
Thank you. And maybe to everyone's point, in terms of how some organizations have begun to try to address this, and as you described, you're reviewing presentations based on written requirements and rules and everything else. Let me ask, I don't know the answer to the question. Are any of your presentations in person, or are they mostly on paper review?
They used to be in person.
Right.
We're 2 years into this type of presentation like we're having today, which makes me miss in person all the more, frankly. It's quite strange to be having this kind of conversation.
Yep.
Compartmentalized as we are, but we were in person.
Okay. But you do this by Zoom, there's typically someone that you see who's doing a presentation. Okay. Where I was going was a lot of times if it's just a paper review, many organizations, school districts, et cetera, have begun to take names and identifying information off of the presented material or the tests or the job application, so that initial bias just based on somebody's name doesn't impact. And it makes a difference. You watch the TV show The Voice. They don't see who they're evaluating. 25 years ago, the New York Philharmonic wanted to have more women in its orchestra, and they put up a curtain so that they couldn't see who was auditioning. And the number of women went up significantly. Then they put down carpet because they could still hear heels clicking across the floor. They put down carpet and the number of women went up significantly again. So just sometimes by who we see in front of us or what name we see absolutely impacts the outcomes because of that implicit bias that kicks in that we're not even aware of, right? If you, to your point, I think, Mike, you use the usual suspects or those regular folks who are coming in doing their presentations, it's going to be slick. It's going to be good. They've got all their I's dotted and T's crossed versus XYZ company who maybe you have a different opinion on, and maybe you hear it differently or you see it differently. Not you, but just as an example of how sometimes that bias can come in that, again, we're not aware of. And so unless we can become conscious of what our biases may be, those continue to impact our decision making, even if we don't know it. And that's separate from an evaluation of those requirements and those rules and the language that's in the ordinance about how you evaluate. That's a whole nother conversation. That's about institutional that we'll get to in just a moment. But that's an example.
I was just going to chime in quickly of the this is kind of a reverse bias, or I don't know, maybe it's not, but we often will get applications that have really slick, beautiful renderings and showing a lovely building that's going up, and they have little people in there, pictures of people, and all of the people are white and young.
Yep.
And I just want to send it back to the applicant and say, put some people of color and some people of varying ages, put babies in, put older people in, let's mix this up. This is not, I know who you're aiming for marketing, and that's not what we're aiming for design review. So.
Great example, because I've seen it way too many times, way too many times.
And I'll say that sometimes there's the opposite where we have done exactly that. It's just personally as a practicing architect, where we have instructed our renderers to put in people of color, children, to put somebody in a wheelchair, show differing ages, abilities, that kind of thing. And we've had clients ask us to take them out.
Yeah.
So.
Yep.
Yeah, that's different. That's been a thing for us as well. It's and it's been interesting in that space as well. Even just the resources, it's been great in the last few years to have more people focused on providing those assets that are used in renderings and other things to kind of broaden the libraries of people that are available for these things. It's been great to see. We've had the same challenges as Heather's described in terms of those things from developers, and it's all to do with exactly what Jennifer decided, which is who we're trying to get here. Is versus who is this for? So it's an interesting place where those biases become explicit a little bit.
It's a hotel lobby. You're going to have somebody in a wheelchair in your hotel lobby at some point. It's okay to put them in a rendering.
And I would suggest again that's based in fear of not reaching the folks who we really want to reach. Because if you put too many folks of color in, if you put those folks in a wheelchair in, then the other clients who we really want to come and avail themselves of our services or our hotel maybe won't come because they have a different perception of us. That's my not so humble opinion, but I would suggest it's based on the fear of, again, loss of our desired clientele if we put too many of those folks in the picture. And I would love to hear if you disagree with me.
Yeah, I agree, and it's also this perception of what's safe.
Mm-hmm.
You know, what's got the least risk, what gets, right. Which is just something to be worked against.
Right. Which I would still say is based on their fear.
Mm-hmm.
Right?
Mm-hmm.
Okay. Well, good examples and good conversation. Thank you. So back to the screen. So where do we get our biases? I mean, we get them from the time that we're born, children's books that were read to us, the TV shows we watched, the cartoons we watched, that crazy conversation at your Thanksgiving dinner table, all of those places, your church, your mosque, your synagogue, wherever you go, all of those institutions continue to propagate your biases. And media is just the most huge. So I've just got a couple of examples of media bias in the last few years that continue to propagate the biases that are out there. So this first one is from Nivea. They've done some outrageous stuff over the years. The message on the left is pretty clear. The message on the right, maybe not so much. That for some reason, if you have an afro and a goatee, you are uncivilized if you don't cut that off and put on a white shirt, a V-neck, maybe some wingtips. And the idea of flinging that head across a parking lot, I'm not sure what that's supposed to mean, but the idea that you're uncivilized, and I would also argue if you look like Colin Kaepernick, you're uncivilized. And what that has to do with skin cream, I can't really help you. How you can tell the story two different ways to two different audiences, right? Fox News Latino tells a story about scholarship money for an undocumented student, while Fox News tells a story about money for illegals. Same story, same picture, different audience that we're going to pander to. This is probably one of the more famous ones after Katrina. Top story says a young man walks through chest-deep floodwater after looting a grocery store. Bottom picture is a young white couple. It says two residents wade through chest-deep floodwater after finding bread and soda from the local grocery store. So if you're Black and you're looting and probably a thug, if you're white doing the exact same thing, you're just surviving. So I'm not sure the sound is going to play because I've been having problems with this sound. So if it doesn't play, just let me know. But it's a 26-second video clip from a Washington, D.C. morning show in 2016 that we'll just watch and have a conversation. Or I'll talk you through it as you watch the video, so let me know. Can't hear it?
No.
Okay. So what the story is a conversation showing, what's her name? The Duchess of New York, is this what it is? Anyway, it's a story about the most beautiful face and using her picture as an example of the most beautiful face, which is based on your nose and the symmetry of your face and the nasal tip rotation. And they go on to describe the diameter of the nose and specific description of what the nose is that makes the most beautiful face. So just watch the continued reaction as they talk. So I would suggest there's a whole lot of egregiousness going on there. One, the obliviousness of the two white co-hosts to their black colleagues sitting on the couch with them who can't nor would ever want to aspire to what they're describing as the most beautiful face. The camera person knew it was a messed up story because they knew who to pan to get a reaction. And certainly no one asked either the black man or the black woman to present this story. So I would suggest this has little to do with bias and is an example of whiteness as the default for all things beautiful, professional, intelligent, etc. So by example, it's only been 3 months since Band-Aid figured out it needed to rethink its flesh-colored Band-Aids because they look nothing like me. I imagine most of you can remember the flesh-colored crayon in the Crayola crayon box and what that looked like. When you walk into the restroom and put your hands under the faucet or the soap dispensers that you don't have to touch, those are based on light refraction and infrared. The darker your skin, the more it absorbs light. It had to be redesigned so that they worked for darker skinned folks. And I'm not that dark and I still have to go from sink to sink sometimes. So clearly, no one who looked like me was either in the design phase of the product, nor certainly the testing phase. Therefore, wow, this works great for all of us. Let's put it out. And so there's a process you have to go through when you install these in Pakistan and India and South Africa to ensure that they best work for everyone. If you go down to the bottom of your screen, I don't even think it's on there, where I don't think Jennifer has it enabled, where you can put up, a thumbs up or raise your hand or applause, those reactions that you often see on the bottom of the face or this Zoom call. They will be a little, oh, here it is. I can raise my hand now. So somebody just raise their hand. Go down to the bottom of your screen. She let us do it and raise your hand. Great. So you see what they look like for most of you. Emily's changed hers. And they're just little yellow hands, which represent not me by any means of the imagination. And so people of color have to figure out how to go into our settings, if we even feel like being bothered, to see how we can represent ourselves. And as innocuous and silly as that example may be, it's one of dozens and dozens of things that people of color have to do on a regular basis to do something extra, to put ourselves back into the norm, if you will, or put ourselves back into the process that's being used. Microsoft just has an outline of a hand. There's no color to it. So there's different ways you could do this. But again, clearly, no one was in the room as this platform was being designed and these pieces were being put together who looked like me, and everybody, wow, this is great. Okay, let's put this on here. Colorado was one of now 10 states that have passed what's called the Crown Act to protect against discrimination, the way that hair grows out of Black folks' heads, most specifically Black women. Because the courts have said, if you're wearing your hair naturally in braids or in locks or just naturally in its fullness, you can not hire them or you can discipline or fire them for being unprofessional. There's no need for legislation for a blonde ponytail. And so again, what is the default for professionalism? We were doing this session a couple of months ago, and a Black woman said, the only reparations I ever want is to be paid back for all the money I have spent sitting at the salon to straighten my hair so that I can be considered professional at work.
I used to straighten my hair for years and years and years because I had straight hair as a kid, and then when my hair went curly, my mom was kind of horrified. and so I used to straighten my hair, and then occasionally it would rain and I would not, and my boss would say, you look different. And then when I'd straighten it, he goes, oh, you look so professional. So anyway.
Right. Appreciate that. We appreciate that. And so, these are examples. I mean, artificial intelligence and facial recognition is historically horrific in recognizing darker skinned folks. Last month, Facebook had to put out a national apology because, you're watching a video on Facebook, if you have Facebook, and at the end of a video that you watch, it'll say, if you want to keep watching videos of kittens, click here. Well, this was a video of Black folks doing them, whatever Black folks were doing. And at the end of the video, It said, if you want to continue watching videos of primates, click here. And again, artificial intelligence and facial rec is horrific. And there have been arrests. I mean, there's all kind of ways that this has been used in detrimental ways that impact folks of color because it just can't recognize face. You can talk about photography, we can talk about makeup, we can talk about any number of things where whiteness is the default for that program, that process, that decision, if you will. So I'm going to throw out a triggering phrase to send us to the next conversation, which is another way to describe all the examples that I have in that video is white supremacy. White supremacy has nothing to do with violence. A white supremacist is one who believes in the violent maintenance of white supremacy and is running over people in Charlottesville and covering themselves in swastikas and, you know, slicing necks on trains in Portland, Oregon, etc. But white supremacy is, again, simply whiteness as the default for all those things of beauty, professionalism, etc. I mean, you could Google the prettiest hairstyles and you'll get, you know, 8 white women in Beyonce and Halle Berry. So it's a triggering phrase to so many folks. And I recognize that it is because it has a connotation of wearing a hood, being a KKK member, being violent, all of those things. And so you hear now so many organizations, certainly social justice folks, talking about white supremacy culture. And it's not understood by so many folks in the way that they mean it, which is how I describe. And so the question really is, how does that whiteness as the default, if you will, impact and affect decision-making, program creation, process evaluation, all of those things, because our default is thinking about that dominant culture paradigm in a different way. And so I'll just pause because we've changed up how we do this presentation to kind of walk folks up to that triggering phrase. So I'll ask you if your thoughts on just the whole context of that whiteness as the default, that white culture as default, and then thoughts on the idea of white supremacy and how that resonates with you. Is it automatically defensive causing? Do you just kind of stop listening when you hear the phrase? Would just love to hear your thoughts on the totality of that conversation.
I mean, it's definitely a loaded phrase, obviously, and I think that it comes with that kind of reaction. But at the same time, I think that there's also the sense of the kind of mediaization, if that's a word, of a phrase that has kind of given it all that overtone as well, and it's, a way of describing no doubt, an attitude. I think that this kind of like default to whiteness is definitely something that I've seen, and I'm not from here, but we have the same thing in New Zealand. It's a smaller country with a big Pacific Island culture and a Maori heritage, and we've done some things well there and a lot of things badly, and I'm trying to figure out and navigate that in a similar fashion, maybe not quite as extreme as here, or as an intense a conversation as here, but it's still definitely a part of the colonial culture, and I think that a sort of a mechanism of colonialism, and that's that's pretty consistent in a lot of places around the world, I would imagine.
Thank you. Yeah.
And I am going to just take the opportunity that I have to jump at 10 o'clock, and I apologize because this has been really valuable and really interesting, and I'd love to be able to continue the conversation. As Mike noted, in person would be a great way to do it at some point too. So thank you very much, and I'll hope to catch up with all the rest of you soon, and I'd love to run into you again, Dante, and talk about this more.
Thank you. Appreciate your engagement. Any other thoughts?
Dante, I will confess that my 86-year-old father butt dialed me like he does about 8 times a day in the middle of your conversation of the phrase white supremacy. So I missed a little bit of it. I think you were saying, I don't know, maybe you'd rephrase it briefly for my benefit.
Yeah, that white supremacy or white supremacy culture has nothing to do with violence. The typical reaction or expectation or assumption of it is that it is all about violence and wearing a hood and being a member of the KKK, but it is just, I just interchange the phrase whiteness as the default to white supremacy. And those examples that I were providing of Band-Aids and hairstyles and everything are examples of what that looks like.
Well, I think obviously whiteness as a default is probably just objectively the reality in terms of design, product design, like you said. You know, the phrase white supremacy is like a terrible phrase, and it's received as terrible, I think. So, you know, the point that white is the default to me is different than white supremacy because of the context of the phrase. The way the phrase is received by people and what it comes to mean to people.
Yeah, no, I appreciate that, and I get that, and I my challenge with this conversation is that the phrase is being used by folks who mean it in the way I've described whiteness as default, and so if I don't present it in a way that at least allows this conversation, when you go out of here and hear it, you know, when everyone goes out of here off of these calls and hears that phrase, they immediately default to violence. You're accusing me of being a racist and I'm wearing a hood, versus what the totality of the description really means. So how do we have the conversation, at least so that there's a beginning of a different understanding of the phrase, whether it is still comfortable or not, or perceived? How do we get it to be perceived a little bit more broadly, I guess is the question. Because if we talked about right-handed supremacy, nobody would have an issue. If we talked about able-bodied supremacy, nobody would have an issue. But because it's about race, oh my God, it's a horrific phrase. And so that's kind of my issue.
I guess
Let
it's,
me-
you know,
let me
because it's
give you-
been attached to clannish behaviors.
Yeah,
I mean,
yeah.
it's been linked to very specific behaviors, that phrase,
Right.
and I think it's just hard to unlink it.
Yeah.
That would.
No, and I agree. I appreciate that. I do. I mean, I understand that.
And I'll carry that one a little bit further. I'll always remember, for whatever reason, in a small town in the Czech Republic, I was walking back to my hotel one night, and I saw a group of younger kids with long hair and the dress you might associate with certain types of youngsters. And I remember thinking, okay, this is a fight or flight moment. Which am I going to take? Because it was, I was all alone in the street. There were half a dozen of these kids. And then I realized that they walked by and they could care less about an old man walking along. It didn't bother them at all.
Mhm.
Where that comes in is, I think, part of the meaning of words and how there's more to it than words. White supremacist, yeah, I have to agree with Mike on that. That sets off all kinds of identification bells, let's say.
Mhm.
But seeing some of the actions that might be associated with that, you'd get a whole range of feelings that might or might not come with it. And I'm always reminded of that one incident because, I took it one way, like I might have in certain parts of New York City. And it wasn't that way at all. So it was a good object lesson, but you just wonder whether words have power and words have meaning. And then the one thing I was thinking of earlier, being the only one in this group that's confined to a wheelchair temporarily, I've had the experience of having someone kind of shy away from me because they weren't sure what I had. And so there's probably more to it than just the words. But having said that, the words themselves can trigger something which I think is what you're getting at. It triggers a default position that you don't want anybody to take.
No, thank you, James. I appreciate that. And to your point, Mike, I absolutely understand and agree that it is that phrase that triggers all the things you described, which is why we've changed how we do it, right? And kind of walk folks up to it versus say, here's what this is, and then describe it, because people are done listening at that point a lot of time. So anyway, just offering it, people are more comfortable, white people are more comfortable with the idea of whiteness as the default than the phrase of white supremacy. And so I'm just trying to offer the distinction in that meaning when you will hear it used by people working and doing this work. So
I think I would just add to what's sort of churning in my brain as we're having this conversation is that, yeah, because we have that connotation of white supremacy being the violent piece of discrimination, but that there's so many levels in between that don't get associated with that term that, you know, need to be associated with it. Like you said, the white default. I mean, it's like walk through a Target store and look at the toys, look at the hair care aisles, look at it's just, the bias is everywhere, but we don't view that as supremacy, and it is. So I think that's eye-opening for me, the way you're describing it, talking about it.
I appreciate that. Something to continue to chew on, I'm sure, but I appreciate the conversation and the feedback, honestly. So I'm going to share the screen, and now we're going to look at some of those impacts and what do we do, because we could have these kind of conversations around issues all day, and we don't have all day. So I keep right on going before Jennifer yells at me. So what are some of the impacts of institutional and systemic bias? So just starting out, looking at historic places and those designations, specifically for Black folks, only 2% of all those nationally registered historic places represent Black folks and their experiences. And dollars, you can see where the dollars have been spent over time. And so looking at the ordinance that you are responsive to, you know, descriptions of culture. What is culture, right? And clearly I was surprised at some of this description and definition, as it says it can be more than a place. It could be an event. It could be a craft. So I was shocked by what the definition is of culture and what can be considered cultural for designations. And then, you know, historic context, what does that mean? And again, referring to cultural, social, religious, economic, etc. That description of what historic context is. But how is that really considered? How does that play out in certainly designations of historic preservation, which isn't what you're doing, but in the broader sense, you still are connected to that because you have to relate to those buildings in the downtown historic areas. And so in Denver specifically, and this was from data from a conference that was held here in 2021 in Denver, that only 2 to 3% of all landmark properties are considered diverse. And so going back to those two definitions, if we look broadly at what those definitions mean, I would suggest this number is horrific. Jennifer?
Yeah, so we added the cultural aspect to our ordinance in 2019. So it's horrific and we're trying to fix it. And that's why, that's why it's slow going, but it's getting better. So that number I think is actually going to be higher, is higher now based on a couple of designations that have happened recently, but still long way to go.
Okay, great. No, that's good context. Appreciate that. And it took till 2019 to recognize what that could or should be. Right?
Yeah, well, actually, it was in there before, and then it was taken out,
Oh, okay.
and then we put it in and fixed it.
Okay.
So,
Okay. Which again has nothing to do with you, but it speaks to the institutional and systemic impact and evaluation processes that have been in place for how long, right? Decades and decades and decades. And it's just now being considered and looked at. So once again, anyway. So no, that's great. Thank you. So, and this isn't, you don't do anything with zoning, but as an example of zoning, what places are where and why are they there, right? Zoning by itself was based in race. I mean, it was historically racist. People lived where they lived because they had no choice. I mean, Chinatown didn't spring up because everybody wanted to go there, right? The quote unquote ghettos didn't pop up because that's where everybody wanted to go. It's the only place they could go. And so different examples of what zoning can do to impact, right? And what these zoning, what they are, exclusionary zoning anyway, lot size requirements, etc. But the impacts of those, you will see as it relates to people of color, Black and Latinos, specifically in single family detached homes or areas zoned specifically for that, you will not have the rates of home ownership in those areas for people of color in the same way. Language, coded language, all day. You hear from neighborhood associations, you hear from organizations that want to quote unquote maintain the culture of their area. And what is that language that they're using, that coded language, right? The dog whistle kind of language. Who lives here? What we want to maintain the character or the flavor of this neighborhood. We don't need all that crowding. This is more upscale, right? Well, this is why I left XYZ neighborhood over there. I mean, all of that language still reflects a particular bias. And how do we hear that and recognize it for what it is and not let that impact our decision-making processes? So what do we do? Again, we can put issues out there all day. What do we do? As it relates to one's personal bias, we always say you're going to have your biases. You're going to have that first thought. What's more important is to have that second thought that maybe asks you where that first dumbass thought came from. Is it based in anything in reality? Is it based on, again, those crazy conversations at the Thanksgiving dinner table? Is it based on some TV show I watched a couple of weeks ago? What is it based on? Is it based in reality or factual information? Because if you don't have the second thought kind of interrogating that first thought, then that first thought will rule the day. As it relates to organizations, right? Doing this, how do we become an equitable anti-racist organization, not just a non-racist? Anti-racism implies some action to the work. Everybody wants to be an ally, and I got plenty of those, but what I need is an accomplice or a co-conspirator who's going to get in trouble with me or get in trouble if I'm not there and speak on my behalf for the interests that represent me differently than it represents maybe the dominant culture. But this is just raising the collective awareness, these kinds of conversations. And then how do we just consider how we evaluate our decisions every day? And then again, courageously, unapologetically, and deliberately work to do this and shift how our outcomes are. So how do we really evaluate quote unquote history? What is historic, right? And what does that mean? Does that mean it had to be from 75 years ago? Or can it be from the 60s or the 70s? What are those more recent contributions that still reflect culture and history for particular communities? And how does that impact? Can it impact differently if we consider what history is differently or historic differently? Different ways to bring people into the work of preservation, right? How do we begin to diversify the idea of preservation and who's doing this work? Can there be, internships that are paid? Not everybody has the opportunity to go do an unpaid internship or fellowship. So how can we just create, and these are just examples of things that other cities have done, other commissions have done in other cities in creating these kinds of processes. This is San Francisco. They put out a resolution in 2020 And this is just a small piece of, I don't know, a 15-page resolution with lots of whereases and understanding of history and the historic segregation and marginalization of communities of color in San Francisco. But you can see, one is directing the planning department to do specific things and center people of color. It acknowledges and apologizes for the history toward the people of color in the community, and then makes recommendations on how it should develop proactive strategies. And it, like I said, it's a very long resolution, but I would suggest it's certainly worth a read just for some of the ideas and things within it. But again, examples of what we can begin to do differently, taking specific concrete approaches to doing this work. And what does success look like? You know, having this common understanding among all of you about what this idea is. At least have an understanding of the terminology and the language and everything else. Whether you agree or not, you still will be able to have that understanding of a different perspective of language and terminology and understanding. And then begin to evaluate differently, look at things, policies may change, as Jennifer has described, the ordinance language being changed. There's just a shift in how we can talk about this, how we can talk about race and culture and how that may impact how we can evaluate differently. It becomes a more normal conversation. And then you'll see changes in outcomes. And to Jennifer's point, there'll be increased designations and representations of different cultures that are in and around the city and county of Denver. And so you may have heard people talking about an equity lens. You know, how do we do this work? An equity lens, it's just a critical thinking exercise. It's just a series of questions. And so we offer 4 basic questions that you can apply to most anything that you do in the work that you do. The first one's similar to, you know, have the second thought. What are the assumptions underlying this policy, this practice, this ordinance? Why do we think this is the best way to do this? What's this based on? Or maybe, well, we're not going to do that because of this assumption. How do we interrogate those assumptions to ensure that they are factual and no representations of the best way to do work? How might this particular approach burden specifically communities of color? In this context, we're talking about communities of color. But if you think back to our definition of equity, when one's identity can't predict the outcome, you can plug any identity into this that you want, be it a disability, be it size, be it gender, be it whatever that might be, to see how well we're doing. And then how do we involve those who are most impacted in the decision-making process? And I don't know how you hear from communities, if at all, to determine or influence your decisions in whether we should or shouldn't allow this work to happen in this particular building or in this particular area in lower downtown. But how do you hear from those who are going to be most impacted in the decision-making process? And honestly, government has a horrific history in not doing well in hearing from communities, because I've been in and out of state and local government for a long time, and well, we know best. We know, because this is my job. As I've studied, this is my job. I know how to do this best on behalf of, without ever really knowing if this is in fact what the community really needs or wants. And then finally, what are some strategies to reduce or eliminate the negative impacts based on what we've identified? And there's no data question in here, but you can't do or answer many of these questions without the data being available, you know, to the point of 2%, 2 to 3%. Is that the current data? What does the data look like? Because if we don't know where we are, then we don't really know how or where we need to go. And so really just asking the question. And asking these questions, or asking questions about how might this impact folks with a disability? How might this impact women? How might this impact communities of color? Is not an accusation of being racist or sexist or anti, you know, whatever that might be. It's just a question of how are we doing? Do we know what our baseline is? And so many folks take that question of an accusation of, well, you think I'm doing something wrong? You accuse me of being racist? No, I'm just asking, do we know how well we're doing? It has nothing to do with you, the big picture you, but do we know how well we're doing or what our baseline information is? So this is an example of an equity lens. And we had city council and school board members and others put this on coffee mugs and set them on their desks so they can consider these as they're evaluating what they do. So this kind of ends the whole context of the morning and our, at least, content, if you will. But would just love to pause and see if you have questions, thoughts, challenges, disagreements, just to see if we can open up for maybe a little more conversation before I give you back the rest of your time. Does it resonate? Does it make sense with what you do? Are you so constrained by the ordinance and the language and what you're evaluating that this doesn't make a difference because it's all?
We're so constrained, Dante, honestly. You know, we are applying guidelines that we didn't write specifically to applications that we passively receive because they pass through the system and arrive at our agenda. So while so much of this is incredibly interesting, it's like super relevant to Landmark Preservation Commission, I think. Super relevant to planning. You know, we are implementing, does this application meet the design guideline? Trying to be as objective as we possibly can. Some of our design guidelines might, which I think these come from city council, correct? But some of our design guidelines, like in terms of height and density restrictions and things like that, that might be relevant because it affects affordability and the economic value of the properties and things like that. But we're a funny little group. So in terms of our official capacity, we're pretty constrained. I think. I don't know, does everyone agree with that? I feel like we are.
I appreciate that. I guess as you were talking, my question was going to be, where do the design guidelines come from? Who writes them? Who can alter or edit or change them? And what's that process, assuming that you know, that's even a possibility.
Yeah, so the design guidelines are kind of twofold. So they are adopted by the Lower Downtown Design Review Commission. I think, pretty sure that's who adopted them last time. Might have been LPC as well. It might have been a dual adoption. But the height and density stuff is in our ordinance. And so that is a city council issue. So it's kind of twofold, which is unique.
I appreciate that.
Yeah, I would say, to answer your first question, it very much resonates with what's going on, I think, with us and the city and globally. But, and I agree, Mike, that we are, you know, currently somewhat constrained. And so the question in my mind is, how do we address that? And, you know, do we as a group want to address that? And if so, how? Because it does seem like, you know, how we can, you know, taking that list of questions, Dante, that you provided and kind of thinking about our design guidelines, you know, how can we, you know, maybe go through that analysis and determine, you know, can we better address the concept of equity within these processes that exist. And I do think, to credit Jen and her staff, that, you know, the city has been making progress in that area, you know, with some of these designations, recent designations, and just better context information. I mean, to me, I would love to see, you know, I think that we view the context of LODO as sort of written. And I think there's many layers that are missing. And so, you know, how can we, or can we as a body, you know, figure out a way to progress that so that there is greater context that inform these guidelines, if that makes sense.
I got to think, Dante, there's a couple things that I see is, first of all, I think I'm probably the only person living in Lodo, which is being dictated, not dictated, but being affected by decisions which are made by this group. And other people. One of the things I mentioned earlier was the use of the streets. 25% of the land area in lower downtown streets. sidewalks, public spaces. And yet the people who have power over all of the things that are done on those, it's not anybody in this group. I'm thinking of one of the things we're going through right now in one of the community organizations that I sit on, Lower Downtown Association, Lower Downtown Design Association. We're working with the Chinese, the Asian community, Pan-Asian community, on a specific area that has a great deal of interest, which is exactly parallel to what you're doing, to give them a voice, give them an emphasis on some of the things which were part of Lower Downtown. And that, to my knowledge, I don't think Jennifer had come up before City Council at all, and they made a presentation there, but they're trying to go through the beginnings of what do we do now? Well, how do we get involved in this? And yet I think about the stuff in Tulsa, which I was, as a historian, I wasn't even aware of until earlier this summer. And now that kind of thing, which obviously had to have happened here, there's just a whole bunch of things whirling around in there that I think we could use a lot of help on deciding, determining, and a lot of conversations on what is best for Lower Downtown. Do we want to be frozen in amber? Probably not. On the other hand, we have things which are in there, such as height limits, which make me feel very thankful that the highway department got booted out of here 20 years or 30, 40, probably 50 years ago, Jen, when they wanted to make this an interchange for an interstate highway. And that's what preserved us in amber for a number of years. And there's a lot of conversations could be had on that, which are far broader than the Black community. And you're certainly in one key aspect of it, but I think there's a lot of others too that we need to be concerned with. All the same questions.
Right. Thank you for that. Okay. Well, I appreciate all of your engagement. Seems like it's been thought-provoking at the very least, and hopefully you can find some way to continue to connect this to your work or the work that you do as a non-commissioner. But it's just, how do we ensure that we are serving everyone in the way that we say we are serving everyone is the fundamental question. To put the finer point on that, how are we ensuring that we're serving our communities of color that have historically been underserved and marginalized in order to ensure we're serving everyone well? Because if we focus on those communities, then we're also improving how we look at all other communities. So I appreciate your work and your willingness to share and be vulnerable in this conversation. And I wish you continued success. Jennifer knows how to reach me if you need. So thank you.
Thank you. Went off mute. Did you have something you wanted to add or? No. Okay.
Were you asking me?
No, Mike was off mute, and so I just didn't know if you were.
Thank you, Dante.
Yeah.
I'm just again thinking this event, which has been really thought-provoking, would be so much better in person. I hope we get back in person.
Yeah.
It's just so much is lost in this format. But I don't know. I was going to ask you, Jennifer, when are we getting back in person? Is there an update on that?
No, no, that's the big problem. Do you remember how I think I said in July we ordered the hardware to do virtual meetings, hybrid meetings, and all of our conference rooms are getting updated, but that equipment is still MIA, like it's still in order somewhere, maybe potentially at a supply chain. Yeah, exactly. Who knows? So, even on Monday, I was like, what's going on with this? So TBD still. I thought it was going to be August. It's
Yeah.
December. So, spring, I'd say, hopefully. And I agree, this would have been wonderful in person, but I'm so glad we were able to do this before the end of the year, because we were able to have some fun this year to do this. Unfortunately, next year, one never knows, but no, this is really great. And this is the second time I've heard it, and I will hear it again tomorrow with LPC as well. But it's always thought provoking and gets my creative juices flowing on the work that we can do as a landmark team, but with our commissioners. I would love to, we've talked about updating the design guidelines several years ago, and it kind of fell by the wayside because of more pressing things, but it's still on the radar of things that need to happen. And so we would love to, I'm sure that the way we will do it is very similar to how we're doing our general design guideline update, which is to approach the community first and then come up with the regulations, as opposed to writing the regulations and seeing if they're kosher with the community.
One other thought, and I'm sorry for keep talking. The other thing that's been going through my mind is so many of you commissioners and staff are constantly reminding us about make this pedestrian friendly, pedestrian oriented. Let's remember the public realm, which is really good and really important. And I think that is relevant, Dante, to the conversation about, everybody owns the streets. Everybody should experience the architecture in the neighborhood. There should be no barriers to that. And there has been a real focus in the design guidelines and in the work of this committee to make sure that's always in the front of our minds when we look at new projects. So I think that's great. I'm just kind of reminded that I appreciate that drumbeat that we hear from so many of you on this call, and it's a good thing.
All right. Well, Jennifer, just before I go, if you would send, I'm not sure I have the link, or I can't find a link for tomorrow's meeting. So if you'd resend that to me, I would appreciate it. And otherwise, thank you, everyone, and have a great rest of your day and rest of your week. So thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you, Dante.
I know.
Jane, do you want to close the meeting?
Yes.
Unless you guys want to discuss more.
I did have a quick question, actually. And because Dante showed that the slide of the resolution that was it the city of San Francisco, was it the city council that had kind of made a resolution? Is there any thought about, or is there any precedent to either LPC or LDDRC kind of putting forth resolutions for city council to consider, even if, I think that one there was a symbolic part of it, and then there was a very, concrete part of that resolution. But, given, to Mike's point, we're kind of hemmed in as to what we can do, but, is there an ability to even issue any kind of philosophical guidance or statements for the city to consider?
That's a really great question. And I don't know. I don't think that there's been, at least not in the last 10 years, maybe more, any push of the LPC or the LDDRC to ask the commission to consider, or sorry, the city council to consider certain things. I know there, when we update the ordinance, that goes to city council. When we do designations, those go to city council. But most of the work that we do is, they don't review guidelines. They don't review policies. Those are all you all and the LPC. So, so the short answer is I don't know. The long answer is what I just said. I'll find out.
Yeah, or just any precedent too. I can't think of any of either commission sort of issuing, policy statements or directions that are just supplemental to design guidelines. Just a question, and not one I do. It's time to go, and I didn't mean to open a can of worms, but just something in my mind.
That might be a good, well, one area where the LPC and LDDRC might jump in there is when plans are updated. So if there's a downtown plan that happens, to encourage policy statements there, because those are adopted by city council. When the citywide land use and infrastructure plan, the Blueprint Denver was adopted, that would be a good time. There's plans to make, subtle revisions to it over time to keep it a living document. Same with the comprehensive plan. And at some point in the next few years, we would like to do a preservation plan for the city. And so that would be another great way that would be adopted by city council. So.
Well, the neighborhood plans go through that process as well.
Yep.
And I know for Lower Downtown, it's been 20 years since
Yep.
we've had our neighborhood plan upgraded.
Right.
So maybe that is something to consider.
Yeah, and whenever there are either small area plans or neighborhood plans, because it's the neighborhood planning initiative is clusters of neighborhoods lumped together. So if there's a downtown area plan, I don't know if that's going to be considered a small area plan or a neighborhood planning initiative plan. Technicalities there, but we are involved with those. So we are either subject matter experts as staff, or we are embedded in on the team. And so depending on the amount of historic resources in an area and designated historic resources in an area, we play varying roles. So we'll definitely keep you guys plugged into that if that were to happen.
Jen, I'm sorry, I have to run, so I got to jump off. Thanks, everybody. Bye.
Thanks. And yeah, I think we can adjourn the meeting unless there's any other.
Let you get back to your broad mooring.
I know.
Seems important. Enjoy.
It's very important.
Good.
All right. See you guys next
Thanks,
year.
everyone.
See you next year.
Almost.
Yeah.
Bye-bye.
Happy New Year.